In 1840, the Reverend William Ellery Channing, the founder of the Unitarian movement and famous and beloved minister of the Federal Street Church in Boston, Massachusetts, penned a request to his church's standing committee, their equivalent of the Board of Trustees. In January of that year, the Reverend Charles Follen had perished, along with 142 other people, in the disastrous sinking of the steamship Lexington, while on his way back from New York to Massachusetts, where he was going to serve as the minister of the Church of East Lexington in Massachusetts. Reverend Follen was a Harvard professor, a Unitarian minister, an important luminary of the Transcendentalist movement. He was also William Ellery Channing's dear friend. Channing was writing his board to ask their permission to hold the memorial service for his friend at his church, and the board responded, no. Now, the refusal of the Federal Street Church to allow Channing to memorialize his friend at his own church shocked, bitterly disappointed Channing, and the reason for the refusal caused him to question the purpose and meaning of his entire ministry, what he was doing there and how well he had done over the entirety of his time with them. But the Federal Street Church was not alone in their refusal. In fact, as the Reverend Charles Follen's friends went calling church to church, looking for a place for a service, they discovered there was not a single church in Boston that would allow Reverend Follen a memorial. Not one. In the end, the service was conducted in a rented hall attached to a hotel. Who was Charles Follen? And what was the scandal that caused these refusals? Well, Karl Follen was born in Germany in 1796. As a young lawyer on fire with the liberal ideals unleashed by the French Revolution, he faced government persecution for his radical politics. And so in 1824, he made his way from Europe to New England. There, Karl Follen changed his name to Charles. And due to his brilliance and his knowledge of German and a chance acquaintance with the Marquis de Lafayette, he secured a professorship at Harvard. This was in the days when America had Lafayette fever. Charles Follen thus became the first professor of German literature at Harvard. Now, Follen had brought his native Germanness to Boston with exceedingly good timing, it turns out, because the circle of Unitarian and Transcendentalist intellectuals there were eager to connect with the cutting edge of German scholarship. They wanted to connect with German Romanticism, with German philosophy, with biblical scholarship. German thinkers were doing amazing things, and the American intellectuals, who mostly did not read German, were getting it all secondhand. They didn't even have access to German books. So Charles Follen quickly made the acquaintance of people like William Ellery Channing and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Elizabeth Peabody, and he helped introduce that circle to German literature, the German literature that they were craving. And it's important to note that the amazing Elizabeth Peabody is another figure at the same time who was translating work of German for the Unitarians, right? So she was also doing this work. And in 1828, Follen married Eliza Cabot Lee, daughter of a very prominent Boston family, also an important figure in Unitarian circles. So at the same time as Follen was introducing the Unitarians to German Romanticism, the Unitarians were introducing the Lutheran Charles Follen to Unitarianism. And he quickly found this new religion to be a perfect fit for his liberalism and his commitment to human dignity and human freedom. And so eventually in 1836, he himself would become ordained a Unitarian minister. Now, meanwhile, Follen was introducing the people of New England to other aspects of German culture that would prove to have an enduring legacy in America. The first was the study of this newfangled thing called gymnastics, which had recently been invented in Germany. So in 1826, Follen established, equipped, and managed the first gymnasium in Boston at the request of a group of eager young Bostonian fitness fanatics. And if their experience was anything like mine, then there are descendants alive today who are still trying to cancel their 1827 family membership to Follen's Planet Gymnasia. Seriously, if you know how to cancel one of those things, talk to me after the service, please. The second thing Follen introduced was a German variation of the ancient pagan custom of bringing greenery indoors during the cold winter months. The innovation was called a Christmas tree, and Follen is remembered for being the person to introduce the Christmas tree to America. Now, in actuality, Follen was not the first to bring the custom to America. There were German immigrants who were decorating trees in Pennsylvania in the 1820s. But he was perhaps the first to bring the custom to New England, and definitely the first to catch the attention of polite society with it. And this was through his association with the writer Harriet Martineau. In 1835, Martineau traveled to Follen's home over the holidays, and there she witnessed the unveiling of a decorated Christmas tree to a room full of surprised and delighted partygoers, never seen anything like it. Martineau wrote about the tree then in a popular magazine called Godey's Lady's Book, and later in her own book called Retrospective Western Travelers. And her widely read account is arguably what popularized the Christmas tree as an American custom. So I'm going to read now her description of the unveiling of the tree, just snippets of it. She wrote, "The tree was the top of a young fir planted in a tub, which was ornamented with moss. Smart dolls and other whimsies glittered in the evergreen, and there was not a twig which had not something sparkling upon it. It really looked beautiful. The room seemed in a blaze, and the ornaments were so well hung that no accident happened, except that one doll's petticoat caught on fire. There was a sponge tied to the end of a stick to put out any supernumerary blaze, and no harm ensued. The children poured in, but in a moment every voice was hushed. Their faces were upturned to the blaze, all eyes wide open, all lips parted, all steps arrested. They were told they might get what they could without burning themselves, and we tall people kept watch and helped them with the good things from the higher branches. And when all had had enough, we returned to the larger room and finished the evening with dancing." She says, "I have little doubt the Christmas tree will become one of the most flourishing exotics of New England." And I think we can safely say that Harriet Martineau nailed that prediction. Now, the introduction of the Christmas tree is not only charming in its own right, it's actually part of the larger story of the Unitarian shaping of Christmas as we know it today, because Unitarians were influential in creating the modern celebration of Christmas. We didn't do it alone, of course. It was all part of these larger cultural trends, but we were important players. Christmas was once upon a time a very disreputable holiday. It was more like a carnival or like a drunken pub crawl than anything that we would imagine today. And it took place mostly outdoors in public. Think of caroling and wassailing with elements of social subversion, a day for commoners to play merry tricks and demand favors from the upper class as they went from house to house and pub to pub, wassailing and wassailing some more and singing until it all got a little out of hand. Christmas was actually banned in New England for most of early American history by our dear friends and religious predecessors, the Puritans. So the Unitarians played a role in a larger social movement in the 19th century to bring Christmas indoors and domesticate it. So the custom of gathering around the Christmas tree that Follen introduced brought the people inside and away from those pubs. And the creation of the custom of giving and receiving gifts was meant to model and reinforce for children their sort of natural virtues of generosity and kindness. The cult of childhood innocence, very Unitarian. And it is a coincidence, of course, that this custom coincided with the rise of the merchant class and consumer capitalism. It was a Unitarian, Charles Dickens, who popularized the notion that the Christmas spirit is uniquely about family and charity, about kindness and human fellowship, right? So whether you celebrate Christmas or not, it is definitely something we can claim as part of our Unitarian heritage. And Charles Follen has pride of place in that. We're the reason for the Christmas tree, y'all. Those are some decent cultural bragging rights. But that brings us back to the question, why was the guy who brought us German and gymnastics and Christmas trees so hated at the end of his life that no church in Boston would give him a funeral? Well, let's come back to that tree and the real reason that Harriet Martineau was visiting Charles Follen on New Year's Eve in 1835. It wasn't to write about Christmas trees. Martineau was visiting her friend because he and his family were experiencing a crisis. Turns out that Harvard had just refused to renew his professorship, essentially fired him. And though the ostensible reason was that he was fomenting unrest on the campus, Follen and his wife Eliza feared that the real reason was his very public opposition to slavery and his support of the cause of abolitionism. And Harriet Martineau had come to pay a visit because she too was an abolitionist. They were co-travelers in this anti-slavery movement, and she wanted to support him, and she wanted to help him find a path forward. Now, in 1835, Boston was both the center of the abolitionist movement in America and at the same time a very dangerous place to be an abolitionist. Massachusetts had been the first state to completely outlaw slavery in 1783. Boston was where William Lloyd Garrison published the fiery abolitionist magazine, The Liberator. It was where the first abolitionist society was founded. It was the heart of the anti-slavery movement. And it was also the home of a rising class of merchants and industrialists who were making vast, vast fortunes on cotton, as was everyone else. You did not need to own slaves to have a stake, a personal stake, a family stake in the continuation of slavery. Just about everyone did. And at the time that Follen was fired by Harvard for his anti-slavery views, members of abolitionist societies, as they called them, were being literally attacked by angry mobs in the streets and at their public meetings, and their signs were being burned, and they were being harassed and beaten and humiliated and threatened. In 1836, the governor of Massachusetts publicly called out the abolitionists, censored them in an address, and he asked the legislature to make their activities illegal. So in response, Charles Follen was one of a group that met with members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives to argue that silencing the abolitionists would be a violation of the sacred American principle of freedom of speech to begin with, and also it would encourage more of this mob violence. For his troubles, Follen was essentially told by the esteemed legislators to sit down and stop talking. A speech delivered by Follen then in 1836 to the Boston Anti-Slavery Society gives us a taste of how radical Follen's views were, even for abolitionists. In the speech, he begins by grounding his appeal to freedom for black people in the simple fact of their humanity, right? And this is the kind of universal rights argument that would have made total sense to Unitarians. We're all humans, black people are human, humans have fundamental rights, they should be free. But he then goes on to criticize those who want to end slavery but keep segregation. He said, if we do not allow black people, for example, to be with us at our anti-slavery meetings just like the one that we're all sitting in here right now, he says we're guilty of the same inhuman prejudice that underlies the entire industry of slavery. This was a much more uncomfortable position for him to take, because plenty of abolitionists were at the same time racists who did not want to socialize with black people at all, did not want them in Boston society, and did not see any conflict there. Follen then went on in the same speech to appeal to universal women's rights on the exact same grounds. A still more radical position. And finally, he called on all people everywhere to advocate for anti-slavery, and he condemned those Northerners who chose to stay silent on the issue as being hopelessly complicit and just as guilty of supporting the system. So this kind of uncompromising moral clarity on the issue of slavery made him an extremely unpopular figure in Boston. Many of those silent Northerners he was condemning owned pews in Unitarian churches. When the great William Ellery Channing, founder of Unitarianism, finally took a public position against slavery in 1835, he himself having chose to be silent for 10 years, when he finally spoke up, his public position essentially cost him his ministry. Of course, no one was going to fire the famous founder of Unitarianism. No one was going to fire William Ellery Channing. But Channing found that his own congregants would cross the street to avoid talking to him. And so in 1838, now an ordained Unitarian minister, Charles Follen left Boston and took a job at All Souls in New York City. And his first sermon preached on Thanksgiving Day was a sermon against slavery. And it was the only one he ever preached at that church. He never preached directly against slavery again, but just the one sermon was enough to get him fired again. The story goes that the shocked All Souls congregants agreed with his views, but not that he said them out loud. Several prominent congregants walked out during the sermon. He was gone within the year. Follen ruefully remarked to his wife, "Had I been willing to lower my standard of right, the world would have been with me and I might have obtained his favor, but I was not willing." So Follen next accepted a call at a new Unitarian church in East Lexington, Massachusetts, for which he designed the building himself, like you do. The building is still standing today as the home of the Follen Church Society, a UU congregation with about 400 members. At the groundbreaking for the new building, Follen prayed, "May this church never be desecrated by intolerance or bigotry or party spirit. More especially, its doors might never be closed against anyone who would plead in it the cause of oppressed humanity. May its doors never be closed against anyone who would plead in it the cause of oppressed humanity. Within its walls, all unjust and cruel distinctions must cease, and there all men might meet as brethren." That was his prayer. Follen was coming back from a trip to New York to officially begin his tenure as minister at this church when he died in the shipwreck at the age of 43. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society asked to hold a memorial service in Channing's church. Channing passed the request on to his board, and the board said no, as did everyone else. No anti-slavery society gathering was welcome in a Boston church, even if it was to bury a Unitarian minister, even if Channing himself was doing the asking. The UUA's Tapestry of Faith's curriculum tells us that from that moment on, Channing essentially resigned as the congregation's minister. Although he and the congregation did not formally end their relationship, it says, he relinquished his salary, ceased to act as their minister, and preached only once more to the congregation before his death in 1842. So, why am I telling you this rather unhappy story today? Well, I want you to know the story of Charles Follen as part of our Unitarian Christmas heritage, because Follen to me represents twin aspects of the Christmas myth that Unitarian Universalists should be able to engage with. First, there's the warm and cozy side of the Christmas myth, which we find in the well-worn imagery of the Gospel of Luke, which is probably familiar to you from Christmas carols, even if you haven't read the Gospel of Luke, right? There's the innocent baby safe in the manger. There's the silent night, the twinkling stars, the awestruck shepherds, the angels singing their message of peace and joy. Right? This is the warm and cozy Christmas. And part of our Unitarian heritage is we amplified the warmth and coziness of Christmas for this culture. We turned it up to 11. And the Christmas tree is part of that story, right? Of turning Christmas into this warm family celebration of peace and love. And I love warm and cozy Christmas. I love it. Peace, beauty, joy, neighborly love, lights, singing, candles, Christmas trees, yes, please, all of that. But also, in that same Gospel of Luke, underneath the soft pastoral image of Christmas, the imagery of Christmas, there's this prophetic message of justice and liberation. Because the Gospel of Luke doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus, it begins with Mary. It begins with Mary exultantly singing that her son Jesus is going to topple the proud and powerful and free the poor and the oppressed. You know that hymn, Mary, Did You Know, where the guy is mansplaining Christmas to Mary? She knew, she sings about it in the first book. Jesus is going to topple the powerful and lift up the oppressed. The message that Mary sings is essentially the message from Isaiah, our reading for today. It's a radical message of liberation. It's why Jesus in the story first appears to shepherds, to the poorest of the poor, because it's a message for the poor and for the oppressed and for the prisoner and for the slave that they shall be freed. And this was the message that Charles Follen attempted to make his ministry. And so what the story of Charles Follen also tells us is that radical things are hard, and we often resist them. And our own myth as Unitarians about our own history is that we were on the right side of history all along, right? Cheering on the forces of freedom and liberation, there we were. And the reality is yes and no. We were the people fighting to end slavery, and we were the people sitting silently in the pews, wishing that someone else would deal with this, wishing we didn't have to argue, wishing it would all go away, wishing that we didn't have to make hard choices. And so in the story of Charles Follen, we can find both humility and courage. Which will we be? Remember, even William Ellery Channing was silent on the issue of slavery for 10 long years before he found the courage to speak. So the Christmas story, which is part of our Unitarian heritage, is beautiful and peaceful, and it's also radical and challenging. In this holiday season, whatever holiday you celebrate, I invite you to take time for all the good things that rest and refresh and nourish your spirits. Lean into the warm and cozy, because it's been a hard year and we need warm and cozy. But remember the radical side of our heritage too. We are called to renewal, but we are also called to transformation. To transformation. In the silent night, we are called to speak. What do you want to give voice to in the new year? And in what way can we all get a little more free together?